The whole debacle started with a signal. That's how it always seems to go, doesn't it? Our greatest discoveries, our darkest tragedies, a blip on a screen, a strange wavelength, a shift in the cosmic tune. This one snagged our attention with the subtlety of a freight train off the rails. It wasn't like the tentative nudges of past potential contacts, those hesitant hellos whispered into the vastness of space. This thing blared out its existence, a defiant squawk of intelligent origin. The brass scrambled. World leaders did their panicked huddles. Scientists lost a decade off their lifespans overnight, the kind of aging-only all-nighters fueled by bad coffee and cosmic dread can manage. Within a month, the message was deciphered. It wasn't a greeting, not some universal peace offering. It was a declaration of war. They called themselves the Xylar. They were coming. Now, here's the thing about humans. We like to think we're all brave heroes from the moment we're out of diapers. But faced with certain doom, some of us fall apart. Governments toppled quicker than you can say planetary defense budget. Religions fought tooth and nail, not over who was right, but over who was getting raptured while the rest of us burned. Every doomsday nutjob with a sandwich board and tinfoil hat saw their moment in the sun. Me? I saw a problem that needed fixing. I was an engineer, a rocket scientist to be precise. Not exactly built for combat prep, but someone with my skills might just have a use when the laser cannon started flying. I was right, for about 2 weeks, until the Xylar dropped the real bombshell. Literally, they weren't landing an invasion force, they were altering the atmosphere. A chemical payload that was harmless to most life on Earth. Well, most life besides us fleshy types. Turns out our unique oxygen needs made us a bit too fragile for their plans. Within a year, they predicted breathable atmosphere would be a luxury only found inside museum exhibits. There was panic, of course. Plans to build massive biodomes for humanity's remnants, frantic work on experimental gas masks. Some bright spark even suggested we modify ourselves into fish hybrids. I focused on what I knew. Engines, thrust, breaking gravity's bonds. If the Earth was doomed, then hell, the stars were our next frontier. Time and funding normally hamstringing aerospace innovation? Not anymore. We were building an escape pod for humanity itself. Then came the other twist. We weren't alone. It began with the animal researchers disappearing. Then the wildlife biologists. Strange reports started coming in. Chimps clustering around abandoned labs, orangutans fiddling with keyboards, gorillas stacking crates with unnatural precision. Word spread fast, fueled by the same viral terror that had us all on edge. The higher-ups tried to suppress it, but nothing damns information like trying to bury it. The apes were getting smarter, exponentially so. The Xylar's bioweapon was a catalyst, not the cause. We'd always known primates were bright, bordering on our own level of cognition sometimes. But that little nudge? It had turned them into us, but faster, stronger, uninhibited by our wasteful emotional swings. And by the time we got wise to it, they had the numbers and the organization. It wasn't the apes who toppled our society, it was our own fear. In the scramble, they moved uncontested into the power vacuum, claimed our stockpiles, repurposed our factories, mastered our weapons. It turns out the most dangerous thing on Earth wasn't something from the stars. It had been here all along, waiting for the same evolutionary kickstart we got millennia ago. I watched it happen from the cradle of my half-finished escape ship, not on the news. That had been taken over by an eloquent gorilla demanding our surrender in perfect English months before. No, I saw it through drone feeds hacked from ape encampments and the frantic last transmissions of the resistance. Humanity had traded one existential threat for another. My ship wouldn't be ready in time. It was designed for slow colonization, thousands in cryosleep, not a fighting chance against Earth's new rulers. I thought briefly of turning it into some oversized bomb, a final screw you to the apes as they inherited our poisoned world. But that kind of spite felt hollow, childish. Besides, I wasn't ready to give up the ghost just yet. When they reached my facility, I was waiting, not proudly, not in some brave blaze of glory. I stood knee-deep in blueprints, smelling of welding fumes and sleepless desperation. The gorilla leading their troop was enormous, a silverback that made our most muscled bodybuilders look like toddlers. His eyes, however, those were the ones that made me drop my wrench. They were intelligent, not just animal cunning, but deep, thoughtful intelligence, the kind we humans prided ourselves on. I waited for the guttural demands, the posturing for dominance primates were famous for. What I got was almost worse. "Will it fly?" he asked, his voice rough but carrying a clarity that sent shivers down my spine. With enough time?" I stammered. Where the hell was he going with this? The gorilla grunted, then gestured to his followers. They surged into my workshop, not with destructive fury, but with a precision that was utterly chilling. Toolboxes were seized, machines evaluated. Within an hour, they were dismantling, modifying, even improving my designs. They were apes, yes, but with a grasp of technology that left me reeling. I built a ship to escape the end of the world. Instead, I got trapped with those who were causing it. And they weren't from the stars at all. But there was nowhere left to run, no more time to buy. So I did the only thing I could. I started teaching. Turns out, apes are amazing students, not just mimicking actions, but understanding the why behind them. Physics, chemistry, calculus, they lapped it up with a hunger I hadn't seen in my brightest colleagues. They were strong, organized, frighteningly driven, and they needed my knowledge to make my ship work. The old me, the proud scientist, would have railed against the irony. To hand the keys to my salvation to the things that had taken my planet? It should have felt like a betrayal. But with the Xyler's deadline looming, with the wheezy gasps of those too weak for even basic masks echoing through abandoned cities, betrayal was a luxury I couldn't afford. Instead, an odd sort of alliance bloomed. Me, perpetually sticky with sweat and smelling of machine grease, the apes with their furred brows and quiet intensity, and all of us surrounded by the half-built skeleton of what we prayed would be our salvation. I taught them, they constructed, and every rattling breath we drew felt like a gamble. Months blurred into a frantic blur of metal, wires, and the constant, unspoken specter of that breathable air dwindling away. The apes, they never slowed. They worked in shifts, their social hierarchy now a finely tuned machine fueled by the desperation we all shared. They grasped abstract concepts in hours that would take human students weeks. I began to realize that it wasn't just exposure to the Xyler's weapon that did this, it was also our absence. While we wallowed in panic and existential despair, they surged ahead in purpose. Then came the day we sealed the last panel on the ship. It wasn't a majestic launchpad moment, no cheering crowds or inspirational speeches. It was in a hastily repurposed aircraft hangar, the apes and I smeared with grime, exhaustion hanging heavier on us than the ship itself. We eyed each other across the completed hull, an unspoken question hanging thick in the thinning air. "It will hold 1,000 of your kind," I said, my voice hoarse with more than just exertion. "Perhaps more, if you are willing to endure discomfort." The silverback, who I'd learned was named Koba, tilted his massive head. 1,000 will not be enough, he rumbled, but it is a beginning. I bristled. A beginning? You plan to leave the rest of your kind to suffocate? He fixed me with that piercing gaze, and for a sickening moment, I thought I'd misread the entire situation. Apes were still wild at their core, weren't they? Driven by instinct, incapable of the sacrifice needed for long-term survival? "You will teach us," Koba said. His voice wasn't pleading, it was a statement of fact. Enough to build more of these, to reach the stars ourselves. That floored me more than any declaration of war would have. In their ascent, they hadn't abandoned the rest. Their goal wasn't dominance, it was the same as mine had been all those months ago: escape. The countdown was merciless. The Xyler had predicted a year for their atmosphere change to make Earth uninhabitable for humans. They were off, but not by as much as I'd hoped. Panic was the new norm, not because of invasion, but from the coughing fits that racked cities, the dwindling number of healthy faces in the mirror each morning. Loading the ship became a grim exercise. It was the apes who chose who would live, and who wouldn't. A combination of the strongest, the brightest, those carrying potential young, and a smattering chosen seemingly at random, perhaps to retain something as fickle as hope in their new world. I wasn't among them. My expertise had gotten them this far, but to rebuild from the stars would need people with different skills. Farmers, doctors, people Koba and the others deemed essential in ways I could never be. Launch day dawned not with a bang, but a groan of protesting hydraulics. I watched from within the hangar, a knot in my gut as part of me envied them their escape, and another part dreaded the desolate world I was choosing to stay in. The great silver bullet of my ship groaned, shuddered, then shot towards the heavens with surprising grace. A cheer went up, not just from the apes but from the ragged band of humans who'd stuck by me, hoping for a miracle that never came. Then silence. It settled like a shroud, broken only by the rasp of our struggling breaths. The apes didn't linger. They knew I'd taught them all I could, that our purpose together had reached its end. Koba paused in front of me, his massive form casting me completely in shadow. "You did not have to do this," he said, softer than I'd ever heard him. "Someone had to," I rasped. My throat was raw, lungs burning with the tainted air. "Maybe you'll do better, up there among the stars." His answering grunt was hard to decipher. Gratitude? Disagreement? There was no warmth in it. That much I was sure of. Then, he turned and led his people towards the sprawling, half-gutted complex that had been my life's work, now turned into the cradle of their new society. The Xyler arrived 2 weeks later. I didn't see them firsthand, confined as I was to a dwindling group of survivors huddling in an old bunker. We heard the roar of their engines though, felt the shudder of their landing shake the decaying concrete around us. What I imagined were beings of grotesque shapes and inscrutable technology, ready to enslave or exterminate with bored disdain. What emerged instead was baffling. The Xyler resembled spindly insects with too many eyes and a sickly iridescent carapace. They weren't giants, barely the size of a human child, and they weren't armed, save for communication devices that let out a warbling chirp we guessed was their version of language. They didn't attack, not at first. Instead, they looked confused, lost, even. Monitoring equipment they set up creaked out a grim confirmation. They'd tinkered with Earth's atmosphere all right, but with far slower effect than predicted. We humans weren't dying out as they'd calculated. In fact, most of us were doing annoyingly well. And then they saw the apes. At first, the Xyler treated them with the same dismissive curiosity they might afford a new type of beetle, specimen collection, observation under controlled environments. It didn't take long for their tune to change. An ape raiding party, armed with weaponry cobbled together from our leftovers, snatched a Xyler scout group right out from under their bulbous noses. The lab the Xyler had taken over became a battleground, and I heard stories that made a cold sweat prickle my skin. The apes were ruthless, organized, and grasped the Xyler tech faster than the invaders themselves seemed to. They weren't just surviving, they were fighting back. It's been years since then. The Xyler linger, more like a bizarre infestation than a conquering force. The few human enclaves left have made treaties with the apes, wary ones, but alliances nonetheless. Our numbers are pitiful, our power less than theirs, and sometimes, I wake in the night wondering if we've just traded one cage for another. But then I hear the roar of an engine, not the insectal whine of a Xyler ship, but something cobbled together from old jet parts and sheer stubbornness. It soars overhead, piloted by an ape with a focus Kobo would have been proud of. And I think, maybe this mess of a world, this legacy we left them, maybe it's theirs to fix. Maybe the stars are theirs for the taking after all. The drone buzzed towards me like a disgruntled bumblebee, and I braced for the usual. Requests for medical supplies, updates on our attempts to purify the dwindling oxygen tanks, maybe a terse report of another skirmish in the toxic dust bowls beyond the bunker walls. What I got instead shook the stale bunker air with possibility. "We've cracked it," Amani's voice crackled through the drone speaker. She was young, barely an adult, but the lead geneticist among our ragtag group. "Well, mostly cracked it." "Mostly?" I echoed, heart skipping a beat. Hope was a dangerous drug these days, the last few times ending in bitter disappointment. "That biological catalyst the Xyler hit us with," she continued, a breathlessness in her voice that had nothing to do with the poisoned air. "It wasn't targeted just to humans. It affects them too, just differently. We've isolated the enzymes, figured out its effect on their cellular pathways." She paused, and I knew her well enough by now to read the excitement and fear warring on her face. It was the same I'd seen in my own reflection countless times. The thrill of discovery and the bone-deep dread of what that knowledge might demand. "It weakens them," she finished, voice hushed. "Not enough to kill outright, but it makes them sluggish, vulnerable. And here's the kicker, it targets their brains. Cognitive decline, memory loss, we're talking accelerated mental decay." The implications hit me like a ton of bricks. The Xyler weren't built for the world they'd altered. Their big gamble had backfired, turning them into evolutionary time bombs. Amani was right, this wasn't an instant win for us, but it was a lifeline, a twist in the cruel game we'd been losing for so long. "You're sending samples?" I asked, trying to sound calm, to downplay the frantic surge of adrenaline. "Better than samples," Amani replied, and I could hear the grin in her voice despite the fuzzy drone feed. "We're coming ourselves, and we're bringing reinforcements." That's when the ground shook, not from another Xyler tremor, but from something far more primal. A roar ripped through the bunker, a sound I knew well. It was the apes, a rallying cry of 100 throats. Amani was right, reinforcements indeed. Within the week, I stepped out of the bunker for the first time in years. Blinking against the weak sunlight, my eyes drank in a sight so unexpected it bordered on the surreal. Humans and apes, not side by side, not exactly, but close enough in ranks that their shared purpose was undeniable. We were haggard, the apes still intimidating in their size and strength, but a weariness touched us all equally. It had leveled the playing field in a way no treaty ever could. Amani led the briefing. We clustered around her, doctors, engineers, the few of us still clinging to the stubborn dream of reclaiming our ravaged world. Apes, their leaders anyway, were present too, massive forms that could crush us in an instant, yet their gazes were sharp with a focus we humans were starting to mirror. She explained the science in quick, precise terms, and even the least medically minded among us grasped the core of it. We could weaponize our own extinction. The apes, already formidable, could be augmented with the enzyme. They'd become a strike force, a tide of raw power tipped with the insidious weapon the Xyler had unwittingly provided. We had a chance, not just to survive, but to push back, to make the invaders pay for their disastrous gamble. And there, amidst the ragged cheers and the grim set shoulders, it hit me with the force of revelation. The apes hadn't merely inherited our Earth. They'd also taken on our fight, our thirst for vengeance, the uniquely human cocktail of desperation and spite that had propelled us across the eons. The twist wasn't the Xyler's slow burn demise. The real shock was that, in struggling to save ourselves, we'd also inadvertently changed the apes. They weren't just our successors anymore. They'd become the inheritors of our worst traits as well as our best. The old guilt, a whisper that I'd been instrumental in dooming two species, mine and theirs, was still there, but it was edged with a strange sort of acceptance. The stars, once our manifest destiny, were still a beacon for the apes who'd built ships from our scraps. But here on the ground, the war that was about to begin. It was going to be messier, bloodier, and a damn sight more human than anything I'd ever imagined. The transformation of our desolate world was nothing like the heroic retaking I'd sometimes dreamt of. It was gritty, brutal, and punctuated by more setbacks than victories. Turns out, the universe wasn't too keen on handing us a win, even when our enemy was succumbing to their own toxic hand. For every Xylar outpost overtaken, every scout team ambushed amidst the dusty ruins, there was always the lingering dread of their main force, the unseen queens and commanders lurking wherever their insectile minds deemed defensible. The apes, they changed too. They had always been strong, driven, but there was a ruthlessness now, a chilling pragmatism that would have made those early animal rights protesters faint dead away. It wasn't malice, not exactly. But apes pushed by Amani's enzyme, honed by constant guerrilla skirmishes, they became terrifying in their efficiency. Mercy was a casualty of war, that much I'd always known. But here, with our roles so twisted, I began to question more than just our chance of survival. When an injured ape was dragged beyond enemy lines, not for rescue, but to have his body rigged with explosives, when captured Xylar young were brought back for interrogation, the lines got so blurred all I could see was the crimson stain of necessity on all our hands. We built the camps first, not the hopeful shelters I'd once envisioned, but stark, utilitarian things meant to contain, not comfort. The apes, once masters of the wild spaces, adapted to their concrete cells with grim acceptance. They bred, not with the slow consideration of building a future society, but with the urgency of soldiers bolstering a dwindling army. The humans among us became teachers, keepers of a knowledge base not about progress, but about exploitation. There was no glory here, no righteous march to victory over the Xylar. We became them in a way, mimicking their callousness, using their own weapon against them as we cowered behind the warriors we had made. The knowledge of what we'd become gnawed at me. Late at night, watching the centuries cycle past, both human and ape, I wondered if this was what Koba had foreseen, back when the ship was still just a blueprint and the stars a promise in his eyes. I sought him out once we'd established a semblance of control. My old workshop had become their headquarters, jury-rigged with tech scavenged from Xylar outposts. Koba held court there, surrounded not just by his generals but by ape scientists who were as frighteningly brilliant as their human counterparts. The silverback barely acknowledged my presence at first, eyes fixed on a tactical map etched directly into the old concrete floor. "We were meant to be different," I blurted out, unable to stop the bitter words. "Up there, building new worlds, not this." Koba finally looked at me, and the tiredness in his eyes was a reflection of my own. "Different?" he rumbled. "We are what we must be. You made us this, human. To survive, to win against what came from your skies." "At what cost?" I shot back, all my carefully built diplomacy crumbling to dust. "Don't you see? We are the monsters now. We use your young as disposable bombs, we." A shadow fell across us, and I looked up to see Amani. She'd grown into a hard-faced woman, the youthful optimism tempered with a ruthless streak honed on the battlefields of a dying planet. "The first shipment is ready," she informed Koba. He didn't ask for details. Neither did I. We both knew. It was Amani that I looked at as the ape strike force marched out, young, strong, dosed up with the enzyme that wasn't just our weapon, but their death sentence. "Those stars," I whispered, remembering the ship, the dream that now felt like a lifetime ago. "They were meant for them, Amani. We stole them." She didn't try to comfort me, to justify our choices. She met my gaze with the cold clarity of a true believer in a fight for existence. "They're too far," Amani said simply. "We have this world to take back first, and there's no guarantee the next one will be any kinder." As I watched the apes fade into the ruins of what we'd turned our homeworld into, I knew she was right. The stars were a fool's paradise in the face of the grim reality we'd built. And maybe, just maybe, the apes truly were the only ones who could survive what we had created. I couldn't condemn them for taking on our darkness. All I could do is watch, and wonder if out there in the vastness of space, there was any absolution left for those of us left behind. They say victory goes to those who endure, not to those with clean hands or lofty ideals. As I walked through the ruins of cities we retook at such terrible cost, I have no doubt who the victors of this war will be. It's not humanity, frail and teetering on the brink of oblivion. It's the apes, their eyes hardened but shining with a purpose that outweighs even the poison coursing through their veins. I hear rumors, whispers from the ape scientists now dissecting the last remnants of the Xylar threat. Talk of adaptations to fight the enzyme's toll, extending their lifespans far beyond what nature ever intended. They've tasted our desperation, our will to do anything to survive. That hunger will outlive any lingering guilt they may still harbor for the kind I once taught them to be. Perhaps, when the last Xylar husk rots away, when a semblance of order returns, then they will turn their gaze back on me, on the remnants of humanity. And what I see in their eyes won't be gratitude, but the cold calculation of a species that has learned a dangerous lesson. Sometimes, to win, you have to become the monster.